The land along the Stono River breathed with a quiet that did not belong to peace but to the heavy, suspended air before storm season, when the sky hung swollen with humidity and the earth carried memory like a bruise. In 1739, Carolina was a colony of uneasy prosperity, its rice swamps gleaming like coins in the sun, its wealthy planters speaking of empire and God, while living off the backs of men and women who had been stolen from kingdoms and lineages older than Europe could comprehend. The smell of wet earth and rotting husks traveled with every breeze, and beyond the polite edges of Charleston society, the plantations beat with a rhythm of forced labor, pain, whispers, and patience sharpened not into acceptance but into waiting for a moment, a crack, a weakness, a sign, every lash, every separated family, every whispered prayer in Kikongo or Wolof or Igbo fed a slow-burning ember that had not died despite oceans crossed in chains. And for one woman whose name the records would not keep but whose story lived in scars and consequences, grief was not only a private ache, but an awakening. She had been brought from the kingdom of Congo, where Catholic hymns blended with ancestral rites, where warriors once knelt with swords beside altars, and where resistance was neither madness nor sin but duty. When her husband was taken, first in spirit by punishment, then in body by death, she did not collapse. She stood like a cypress holding the weight of a river, unmoving, alive, and waiting for the waters to rise. Her husband had been tall, with the bearing of someone who once commanded respect, not asked for it. On the plantation they had been forced to labor. His strength had made him both an asset and a threat in the eyes of the overseers. They marked him early, not by name, for enslaved identities were always subject to white revisions, but by posture, by refusal to fully bow, by the spark in his eyes that frightened men who believed ownership required complete submission. His death did not come swift. It arrived in punishments piece by piece. A missed quota in the rice swamps here, a resistance in his gaze there. A rumor whispered that he had spoken of escape, of freedom, of Angola, of God seeing all things. The overseer saw disobedience where there was only survival, and the plantation master preferred fear over loyalty. They made an example of him, first through the stocks, then with lashings that carved history into flesh, until the night his breath finally left him in the corner of a shed. His hands still calloused, his body still warm when she found him, his chest no longer rising. She did not scream, did not fall to her knees, did not weep in front of those who believed they controlled grief as they controlled bodies. She washed his wounds with river water at dawn, and buried a piece of cloth he had once worn hidden beneath a magnolia tree, where the scent of earth and blossom disguised tears. In that burial she did not bury love. She planted revolt. Her name, like so many, would not survive in records penned by men who saw her life only as property, and her suffering only as discipline. But the oral whisper later carried among the enslaved spoke of a widow who did not mourn in silence, whose grief became a force that others felt like a rising tide. She was neither frail nor consumed, though sorrow lived in her bones like a permanent winter. She moved as one who understood loss deeply enough to no longer fear its arrival. On days when women gathered to husk rice or hang laundry by the quarters, she offered neither empty hope nor resignation. Instead, she spoke in fragments of the saints her mother had prayed to, of war drums across Angolan hills, of ancestors who refused domination even at the edge of a sword. The others listened, not always responding, but storing each word in the hollows of their ribs where courage lay dormant. Those who were born in the Americas heard from her what it meant to have come from a place where freedom was once muscle memory. Those who had crossed the Middle Passage with her found in her voice the map back to themselves. And always she watched the world around her with the precision of someone preparing for a moment that had not yet arrived but would, inevitably like flood season. In the months after her husband's death, the plantation thrummed with tension. Rice yields were good. The master boasted of profits, but beneath the rice stalks the soil held secrets, messages traced with sticks, footprints left in deliberate patterns, a rhythm pulsed on hollow logs that sounded like celebration to white ears, but like strategy to those who knew it. She moved through these shadows without leading, yet unmistakably guiding. She visited the sick and murmured quiet encouragement. She cradled infants born into captivity and whispered blessings in a language older than English prayer books. She stood beside new arrivals from the African coast and listened to their stories, recognizing in their accents the familiar cadence of river kingdoms and coastal forts. When Jesuit scriptures appeared in the hands of a man named Cato, baptized, literate, and already holding seeds of rebellion in his mind, she felt a shift. Where once faith had been a rope for survival, now it became a weapon, a promise that heaven was not the only realm where justice could exist. Catholic beads hidden beneath coarse clothing clicked with purpose, and the widow's eyes lingered upon them, not as trinkets but as banners. Charleston elites attended church and spoke of salvation while building their wealth through misery. They feared disease and hurricanes but did not yet fear the capacity of those they enslaved to think strategically, to plan, to unify across languages and experiences. But she knew unity was possible. She felt the pull of it like tidewater. She spoke not in grand speeches but in truths whispered, while braiding hair at dusk, while distributing stolen scraps of food to the frail, while steadying younger women who trembled after nights of brutality. She poured strength into the community as quietly as others poured fear. She did not tell them to rise. She reminded them they had risen before. The memory of African resistance, of Ndongo warriors, Congo rebellions, Maroon communities, lived in her like marrow. She kept her eyes on the white world too, observing patterns. When overseers drank themselves into carelessness, when plantation patrols grew lazy near harvest, when gunpowder shipments arrived, when rumors drifted from Charleston docks about wars in Europe and military tensions in Spanish Florida. She noticed which enslaved men whispered to each other in Portuguese, which women bore marks of tribal scarification hidden beneath linen, which elders spoke with a calm that meant they had survived worse. Her grief sharpened her perception. She saw that pain could either break a person or refine them into something that could cut through tyranny. She kept her hands busy not to distract herself, but because creation kept despair from hollowing the body too deeply. She wove baskets that held more than rice. They held stories. She pressed herbal poultices into wounds, each gesture reminding her of the healing her husband never received. She prayed not for mercy but for balance, and balance rarely came without rupture. When the overseer's son tried to taunt her soon after her husband's burial, expecting sorrow to make her fragile, he found eyes that did not lower, and a silence that unsettled him more than any plea could. There were punishments for such perceived defiance, but punishment had already stolen what mattered most. Now it merely hardened resolve. In her presence others found both mourning and momentum. She represented a truth whispered across the diaspora. Those who have lost the world once are not easily frightened by the threat of losing it again. As summer pressed into September, whispers of rebellion moved like wind through sugarcane fields, through rice paddies, through slave quarters lit by stolen candle ends. Cato and others gathered information, Spanish promises of freedom to those who reached Florida, Catholic allegiance binding former Congo Kingdom subjects, the timing of Sunday when white militia attendance at church weakened surveillance. The widow listened without asking for leadership or glory. She carried the idea like a smoldering brand in her chest. If the revolt came and failed, she would die as her husband had, but with purpose. If it succeeded, even briefly, it would tell the world that enslaved souls did not consent to bondage. Freedom did not need to be guaranteed to be righteous. It only needed to be attempted. And she, who had stood beside a man broken by tyranny, who had buried love beneath magnolia roots, who had tasted the bitterness of life stolen, understood that silence was no longer survival. Silence was complicity with her own erasure. She walked the banks of the Stono River some evenings, staring across water that reflected both sky and sorrow. Cypress branches draped in moss swayed like mourning veils, and cranes lifted from the shallows in languid arcs, their wings whispering the possibility of distance. She imagined setting foot on Spanish soil, speaking freely, rebuilding a life with others who remembered who they had been. She imagined hearing drums not as secret signals but as celebration. And she imagined, too, that she might not reach that world, that her fate might be to fall under muskets while shouting prayers in the language of her ancestors. In either outcome she saw dignity. In either outcome she reclaimed something that the lash had tried to erase, the right to define the meaning of her own life. The night before the first spark of rebellion, when the air felt charged as if the very sky knew what was coming, she sat by a small fire behind the quarters and fed it dried palm leaves she had carried since crossing the ocean. Flame licked them, consuming remnants of a life stolen but not forgotten. She did not weep. She lifted her face to the smoke, letting it touch her skin like incense, letting memory and future braid together. Tomorrow something would break, Not just chains or silence, but the illusion that submission was the only destiny carved for those enslaved. She closed her eyes, inhaled the scent of burning leaves, and waited for dawn to bring reckoning. She rose before the first light, when the horizon was still a thin charcoal line and the humidity clung to skin like a second layer, heavy and watchful. In the quarters, bodies stirred slowly, conditioned by years of dawns that demanded labor before thought. But on this morning, the rhythm of waking felt different, more deliberate, charged, like the very air hummed with the knowledge that time had shifted overnight. She moved quietly, not wanting to rouse children whose dreams still sheltered them a few moments longer. The scent of ash clung to her, a reminder of the fragments she had burned the night before, remnants of memory that had crossed the ocean with her, now turned to smoke that joined Carolina's sky. Her hands brushed the dirt floor, anchoring herself in the present even as her mind flickered across past, future, and what violence and hope must pass between them. There were no speeches to rehearse, no formal vows to make, only the unshakable truth inside her that survival without dignity was not life, and that grief had already taken enough. By the time the first bird calls in the marsh broke the silence, her resolve was no longer a decision but a condition, like hunger, like heartbeat, like breath. Work began as it always did in the rice fields, yet nothing felt ordinary. Overseers barked orders, muskets slung idle at their shoulders, unaware that those they commanded studied them with new eyes. Cato was not here today. He was preparing, gathering men beyond sight, timing steps with precision learned from battlefields across the ocean, where Congo warriors had marched under banners blessed in cathedrals and oaths spoken in village shrines. The widow bent to her tasks, fingers submerged in water thick with living earth and leeches, her back bowed like the other women beside her. But her mind raced with the careful quiet of strategy. She glanced at the tree line where shadows shifted subtly. Someone out there waited, watching for a sign, a moment when the world might rupture. Nearby, a young girl fumbled with a bundle of rice shoots, her hands trembling, not from labor but anticipation. The widow steadied the girl's wrist, firm enough to anchor her, gentle enough to soothe. Fear would come. Fear was human, but fear did not own them today. In the distance, the sound of church bells from Charleston drifted faintly through the damp air, marking the day of worship for white families who believed the Sabbath insulated them from consequences. It was not salvation they rang for. It was vulnerability. By midday, whispers passed through the fields like wind through reeds, subtle and rhythmic. Someone had sighted Cato moving with others. A pair of men had slipped away unnoticed under the guise of carrying water barrels. Horse hooves echoed from a distant road, though no patrol came into view. She kept her face composed, her movements steady as though nothing in her world had changed, even as she felt the heat rise in her veins like the temperature before a storm. When the overseer rode past, eyes scanning for infractions, she lowered her gaze only as long as custom demanded, then lifted it again with an expression void of submission, void of plea. Nothing but depth and waiting. He dismissed her in the arrogance of those who mistake quiet for harmlessness. The sun bore down, reflecting off water and mud in a glare that stung, but she barely felt it. She felt instead the pulse beneath her skin and the weight of her husband's memory hovering like a hand between her shoulder blades. Not heavy, but present. There had been days after his death when she wondered whether life had meaning beyond enduring. Today answered that question without mercy and without hesitation. Near afternoon, when shadows shortened into hard, direct lines and the air felt thick enough to swallow, a distant shout rose. It was faint but sharp, too sharp to be anything but human alarm. Workers froze for a fraction of a breath before training forced them to move again. The overseer paused, squinting toward the road. Then another sound, gunfire, muffled by distance but unmistakable. A flock of birds lifted from the trees as though startled by an unseen hand. The widow did not look up. She continued working, though her fingers trembled now with restrained electricity. A woman beside her muttered a prayer under her breath, not for safety but for strength. Across the marsh, another overseer rode rapidly toward the sound, leaving only one armed man to watch dozens. It would take time for him to understand what was happening. Arrogance always delayed comprehension. She waited for the moment to come closer. Rebellion moved like fire. It needed oxygen, space, and timing. Once flames caught, control disappeared, and the only choice was whether to run from the blaze or become part of it. The cry came at last. Nearer this time, a call in accented English and Congo tongue. Urgent and rising. The widow straightened slowly, eyes fixed on the tree line where figures emerged. First 2, then 5, then more. Some carried muskets taken from a store, others held farm tools turned weapons, and all moved with purpose, not chaos. The overseer shouted, raising his firearm, but 3 men reached him before he could fire, knocking him from his horse and binding him with violent efficiency. Panic rippled through the fields like a sudden gust. Some enslaved workers dropped to their knees, confused or terrified, years of conditioning warring against the instinct to run or fight. Others froze in calculation. But many, those who had listened, who had waited, who had known that grief and rage needed incarnation in action, rose. They stepped back from the rice water, straightened their spines, and looked to the widow. She did not gesture grandly. She only nodded once, slow and resolute. That was enough. The girl whose hand she had steadied earlier exhaled a sob that was not sorrow but release. A man loosened the rope that cinched his waist and let it fall like a shed skin. Somewhere behind them a voice cried out, declaring God on their side, freedom as birthright, dignity as fate. The widow did not lift her voice, but she felt each word like drum beats beneath her ribs, ancient, familiar, commanding. They moved. Some ran to join those already armed. Others gathered tools, children, elders who could walk. The widow walked, not hurried, her posture that of someone who had already crossed a threshold and would not return. The air filled with sound, cries, commands, the dull thud of hurried feet through wet mud, the clatter of stolen guns. The widow paused only once, turning her gaze toward the shed where her husband had taken his last breaths months ago. It stood unchanged, weathered wood, rusted hinges, indifferent to the lives it had swallowed. For a moment she saw him again, lying there as dawn crept in, his chest unmoving, and she felt a pang of pain sharpen into something fierce, not tender. She did not whisper his name. Names were for the living, and he lived in the purpose of this movement, in the defiance that surged around her. She touched the shed's doorframe with 2 fingers, a gesture not of goodbye but of continuation, as if marking the place where a seed had been planted and had finally broken soil. Shouts rose from the direction of the road, white voices now, frantic, alarmed. Smoke drifted faintly from trees where gunfire had struck. Someone nearby cried that more rebels had taken horses. Someone else yelled for those who could not fight to move south toward Spanish sanctuary. The widow stepped in line behind a man she recognized from the neighboring plantation, a quiet one who rarely spoke, but whose eyes now burned with revelation. She had no weapon in her hand. Her weapon was her presence. She walked with the certainty of a woman who had already endured the worst a human life could hold, and had chosen action rather than surrender. Around her, energy surged, chaotic yet guided, not by a single leader but by collective momentum shaped by years of shared suffering and inherited resistance. Every footstep felt like reclamation of body and ground. Every breath felt like an act forbidden but now freely taken. Children clung to mothers. Elders leaned on younger shoulders. A boy no older than 12 held a broken hoe as though it were a spear. The river shimmered nearby, reflecting sunlight off its restless surface as though mirroring the rising defiance of those who moved beside it. The widow lifted her face toward the breeze sweeping off the water. For a heartbeat she smelled salt and mangroves, felt memory tug her back to a shoreline across the sea. Then the present reclaimed her. She was not there. She was here in Carolina, in a moment where history cracked open like a seed pod. The world ahead offered no promises. The Spanish border lay far. Militia forces would gather. Blood would spill. But she was no longer a woman trapped in mourning. She was a force among forces, a tide unbound. And as she walked, she whispered, not to others, not even to herself, but to the ancestors whose footsteps echoed inside her bones. Words not of fear, but of arrival. They moved southward in a line that stretched and contracted like a living rope. Not yet an army, but no longer a collection of isolated lives bent under individual grief. The road was little more than packed earth worn by carts and patrol hooves, bordered by tall pines whose needles whispered in the slight wind as if bearing witness. With each step, the widow felt the weight of the land, heavy with humidity, history, and the unspoken knowledge that once this path was taken, there would be no return to the old life of silent endurance. Children whimpered softly in the arms of women who stroked their hair with steady hands despite racing hearts. Men scanned the tree line as if expecting ambush with every rustle. Yet for all the fear, there was a strange stillness among them. like the quiet at the center of a firestorm where heat and motion pause for breath. The widow felt this stillness in her bones, not as peace but as focus. She had lost the man who once held her world together. Now she held herself upright through something deeper than hope, something closer to duty. As they advanced, they passed a small farmhouse. Smoke curled from its chimney, peaceful and ordinary. Yet to the rebels it represented a system built on their lives. A group of men peeled off from the procession, determined and grim. There was no gleeful destruction here, no frenzy, only necessity, only the fierce understanding that every structure feeding the machine of bondage was part of the chain that held them. Shouts cracked through the air. A shot rang out, followed by the frightened cry of livestock and the pounding retreat of someone unarmed fleeing the chaos. The farmhouse was set ablaze, flames licking its walls in greedy tongues. The widow did not turn her head, but she felt the heat even from the road, saw the flickering orange in her peripheral vision. Fire, she knew, was both destruction and cleansing. It devoured, but it cleared space for what might one day grow in its place. Still, her stomach tightened, not from regret but gravity. Violence reshaped the world. It also marked those who wielded it. To lift a hand against oppression meant accepting a burden that would never fully lift, even if freedom came. Ahead, voices rose, men calling to one another in a mixture of languages that braided together like vines. English, Kikongo Portuguese, Lowcountry Creole. Among them walked survivors from the Middle Passage and those born into bondage on Carolina soil, united not by uniform or formal oath, but by shared wound and shared reclamation. Some wore rosaries, beads clicking like quiet metronomes of purpose. Others bore tribal scar marks that glinted faintly when sweat traced their skin. One man carried a worn scrap of cloth stamped with a cross, the remnant of a baptism from a Portuguese missionary on African soil. Faith traveled with them, not as submission but as armor, as memory of a world where they once stood upright under different skies. The heat grew merciless as the sun climbed higher, pressing down on skin and lungs. The widow wiped her palm against her skirt. Her throat felt parched despite the moisture in the air. Ahead, the road dipped into marshland, muddy and thick, threatening to swallow ankles with each step. The group slowed, stretching into single file to navigate the narrow bend. Frogs croaked from unseen hollows and insects hummed, unaware of history trembling through the earth beneath them. The widow's foot sank deep into mud, and for a heartbeat she felt the primal pull downward as though the land wanted to reclaim her, to pull her into stillness once more. She wrenched her foot free, setting it down again with renewed intent. Freedom demanded forward motion, even through mire. As they crossed the marsh, they encountered more enslaved workers from nearby fields, men and women whose bodies were bent from years of labor, but whose eyes widened at the sight of this procession. Some froze, uncertainty carved into their features. Others stepped forward instinctively, as though the sight of unshackled determination triggered something dormant. The rebels did not shout commands or force allegiance. They paused, letting their presence speak. A young man with shoulders hardened from carrying water buckets hesitated only a breath before joining, wiping mud from his legs as if shaking off another form of restraint. A woman with a baby tied to her chest stood at the edge of the field, clutching a worn cloth with trembling fingers. She did not step forward, but she lifted her chin and murmured a blessing. The widow caught her eye and nodded, recognizing that courage had many forms and not all were meant for the road. By late afternoon, news of the uprising had spread, carried by hoofbeats, terrified whispers, and the panicked haste of white overseers racing to muster militia. The air felt electric with anticipation and threat. The widow could sense it even without seeing the riders yet. The tightening coils of resistance not only among the enslaved, but among those who clung to power. The colony was waking to danger, and with awakening came rage. The first group of militia appeared cresting a ridge, their horses pawing the dirt, muskets gleaming. They halted when they saw the rebels' numbers. Not a small band, but a swelling tide of dark faces, bodies standing proud in the open road. The standoff stretched seconds into eternity. A horse snorted, breaking the silence. A child whimpered. The widow's heartbeat pulsed in her ears like a drum. She did not brace to run. She stood rooted, ready. It began with a single shot, not from the militia but from the rebels, fired by a man whose eyes burned with the memory of a child taken from him. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. Men shouted. Smoke filled the air as muskets discharged and bodies lunged forward. The widow crouched instinctively as a stray shot cracked past. Dirt flew beneath trampling hooves, the air filled with the metallic scent of gunpowder and the raw, iron-tinged smell of blood. A man beside her fell, clutching his chest, his breath gurgling. She grabbed his arm, pulling him aside, though she knew the wound was mortal by the slackness in his gaze. Yet she did not freeze. She rose again, scanning the field, senses sharpened beyond fear. Women pulled children behind cartwheels and tree trunks. Men rushed forward with stolen muskets and sharpened scythes. The militia, startled by the ferocity in numbers, faltered, then wheeled back, retreating down the road to regroup, shouting for reinforcements. The rebels did not pursue far. They were not reckless. They held the ground they had claimed, gathering the wounded, catching breath, adjusting grip on their weapons. The widow knelt beside the fallen man, pressing his eyelids closed, whispering a prayer that bridged continents. Death was not new to her, but today it did not feel like defeat. It felt like price. When the dust settled, their ranks were thinner, but their resolve thickened. They knew militia forces would return, larger and angrier. They had found the edge of possibility. Now they would push it or break against it. The widow stood once more, wiping blood, someone else's from her hand. Voices called instructions. Move south, travel fast, stay near the cover of woods. The widow listened, then followed, her steps sure. She did not look back at the bodies left on the road. To turn would be to fracture. Instead, she carried them in her spine, in the set of her jaw, in the steadiness of her breath. As evening neared, the sky burned gold and crimson, as though nature itself reflected the fire traveling across Carolina soil. The rebels reached a clearing where tall grasses rustled in the warm breeze. Here they paused to regroup, tend wounds, share water. The widow sat briefly, her legs heavy from exertion, her chest tight. A child leaned against her, exhausted, and she placed her hand on the child's head, thumb brushing sweat-damp curls. For a moment, time softened, just enough to let in a breath. Then footsteps approached. Cato emerged from the tree line, face smeared with soot, eyes gleaming bright and unbroken. He scanned the group, counting with a strategist's mind, mourning with a brother's heart. When his gaze met the widow's, no words passed, yet understanding bridged the space between them. They were bound not by title or command, but by shared origin, shared memory, shared refusal. Night crept slowly, thick and heavy, settling over them like a shroud and a shelter at once. Stars blinked awake overhead, indifferent to human struggle, yet ancient companions to those who sought direction by their light. The widow lay on the ground, knees drawn slightly inward, listening to the low hum of voices, the soft murmurs of prayer, the distant echo of dogs barking in pursuit somewhere far behind. The future was a blade balanced on a hair's width. Beyond this, night could lie capture, execution, or exile, or the faint flickering miracle of sanctuary across the Spanish border. But beneath all uncertainty, one truth pulsed steady. Freedom was not merely a destination. It was already here, in breath taken without permission, in steps chosen rather than forced, in the fire that had been lit not only on plantations, but inside every heart that marched. The widow closed her eyes, not to rest but to remember, to gather the strength of those who had gone before and those who would follow. Tomorrow would demand more than today. Tomorrow would test whether defiance could outrun empire. But tonight, under a sky wider than pain, she allowed herself one brief moment of stillness. Not peace, never peace in a world built on stolen breath, but dignity, the kind that no musket, no chain, no decree could strip. And as she drifted toward a restless half-sleep, the sound of the Stono River in the distance merged with the whisper of wind through pine. A lullaby not of comfort but of promise. Once a flame is lit, even if it is crushed, the ashes remain hot for generations. The weeks following the first whispered pledge felt like walking along the edge of a blade, where every footstep could open flesh or carve a path forward, and Alara moved through that world with a tightening in her throat and a pounding behind her ribs. For she knew that once a spark is struck in a field of dry grass, no human hand can fully command where the flames crawl. Yet she kept her gaze steady and her voice quiet but firm as she tended to those who sought her counsel, guiding them not with fantasy, but with bitter memory and the iron weight of necessity, recounting the cruelty she had witnessed, the lashes that left backs weeping red, the children torn from mothers at the dock near Charlestown, and the way her own life had been sliced cleanly in half the moment her husband was executed, his name erased from the plantation ledger, his existence reclassified from rebellion to property waste. And as she worked, she studied not only hearts but patterns, where the patrols rode and when their lanterns dimmed, which overseers drank to sleep and which paced the veranda restless with suspicion, the time the church bells tolled in the town across the river and how long it took the sound to die, the small times of the day when enslaved traders journeyed between settlements and news passed without detection, the flimsy locks on the gun shed near the rice barn, the way the owner trusted the marsh to protect him more than any fence or watchman, believing nature itself was his guard and the enslaved were too beaten in spirit to challenge geography or law. And yet Alara had seen storms that ripped apart houses as if they were leaves. She had lived enough to know that nature favors movement, not stagnation, and so she used that lesson as quiet fuel, teaching it in metaphors when speaking to the men who looked to her as though she stood at some intersection of spirit and history. And in those nights the air seemed charged, electrified by the knowledge that somewhere across the Atlantic kingdoms moved pieces on maps. Spain offering freedom to those who fled to Florida, and in the Americas rum and rice and indigo bled into each other like grief and rage into the bloodstream of a people who had endured too much to believe silence was salvation. Still, she did not rush them, understanding that the most dangerous weapon against resistance is not the overseer's whip, but haste born from desperation, and instead she reminded them that revolts in other years had failed, not because the enslaved lacked courage, but because watchful eyes were everywhere and betrayal could live even in a familiar face. She remembered stories from her husband about men in Jamaica, who rose with machetes only to find themselves alone on the mountainside by sunrise, and he had always said courage must be steady, not sudden, or it collapses like a cracked beam under weight. So she held his words the way one holds a relic, subtle but sacred, and she watched the group grow, not quickly but steadily. A carpenter with arms thick from sawing timber, a woman who cooked for the main house and quietly pocketed small scraps of news as if they were weapons sharper than knives, a young man who had lost siblings to fever and carried grief like a blade under his tongue, a field hand who prayed at night in the hush of the pine stand, mixing Christian hymns with rhythms of his ancestors, and each approached her in solitude, never in pairs, always in darkness or deep shade, always after a pause in which they made sure no leaves shifted in ways human feet might cause. Gradually, what began as a promise hardened into strategy, and Alara spent nights awake, tracing plans in her mind the way one might trace scars, memorizing escape paths through the rice dikes and swamp reeds, places where patrol horses sank too deep to follow, and she found herself studying the stars not for beauty but for direction, noting which constellations marked the path south. And though she knew the border of Spanish Florida lay far beyond the horizon, she also knew that freedom is not measured in miles but in moments. Moments when fear bends but does not break resolve, when a whisper becomes a vow sealed in shared breath. And sometimes she imagined her husband's face in the shadows, not as a ghost but as a reminder that her grief was not a tomb but a weapon honed by injustice, and she refused to let it rust. Yet threats crowded the edges of her purpose, pressing like wolves circling prey. For rumors began drifting among overseers about unrest stirring in the region, reports of enslaved men found praying too fervently, women gathering herbs too late at night, movements that overseers interpreted as signs of African plotting, and slave patrols doubled, their boots beating the ground with a brutality meant to echo into the marrow of every enslaved person who heard them, and dogs were brought to the gates, their snarling forms patrolling with noses trained to catch fear as much as scent. And at night the white men in town traded stories fueled by paranoia and liquor, convinced that uprisings were contagious like fever, spreading invisibly yet fatally, and every soul with power seemed to walk with a tension that seeped into the air thick as swamp humidity. Alara remained still in the storm of suspicion, moving with the grace of someone who has always known she lived one step from death, and she never raised her voice, never let her eyes linger too long on any co-conspirator. But she did begin to test their collective readiness, speaking to them in questions meant to reveal fragility. Would they run if a friend faltered? Could they act if blood spilled? Did they understand that freedom might demand a price that history would take decades to repay? And though some trembled, none withdrew, and that gave her both hope and dread, for she understood that once men commit their souls to liberation, even failure becomes a kind of victory in memory, yet in life it is often suffering first. Then came the moment she recognized as the turning point, subtle but unmistakable. When she passed by the dock one evening, she overheard traders discussing shipments of muskets bound for militia use and rumors that Spain might soon tighten or loosen its promises to fugitives. and as they spoke she felt history inhale, as though the world itself prepared for a rupture, and she knew stagnation would be more fatal than action. That night she found the carpenter in the tool shed sharpening a chisel as if it were a sword, and he did not startle when she appeared, simply looking at her with a steadiness that told her he was no longer waiting to be led. He was ready to move, and such readiness spreads the way sparks spread through pine straw after a dry season. In those same days she found herself gathering fragments of courage in small acts, braiding hair tighter as if weaving resolve into each twist, humming melodies too soft to hear yet strong enough to settle her nerves, kneeling by the river at dusk to touch the water that had carried so many souls across oceans into bondage, whispering not a prayer but a promise, and when she rose she felt an ancestral presence not mystical, but grounded in bloodline, the knowledge that no atrocity erases origins, and she carried that truth into each step thereafter. By the time word filtered in that a distant plantation had suffered a fire believed to be intentional, she knew the moment was near, and that fire, always symbolic, always feared by those who built power on fragile foundations, would soon become more than metaphor. And as the August heat thickened, she noticed the whites grew more restless, grasping pistols more tightly, glancing over shoulders more often, while the enslaved moved with a calm that masked the turbulent drumbeat beneath their chests. And in that duality Alara saw the world split in two, those who clung to control and those who prepared to seize dignity. On the eve before action, she returned to the place where her husband died, standing in the shadows unseen, her breath steady despite the memory rising like steam from hot earth, and she envisioned the rope, the crowd, the silence after his body stilled, and she placed her palm against the rough trunk of a tree that had seen it happen, whispering not farewell but continuation, then walked away without looking back, because she had learned that grief looking backward becomes a shackle, but grief walking forward becomes a torch. And so, when the crickets hummed loudest and the air hung heavy with the scent of river mud and jasmine, and the moon cast silver across the marsh like a faint blessing, she returned to her people, and they gathered without ceremony, without raised voices, without trembling hands, their faces lit by nothing but conviction and night's quiet approval. And they did not speak because words were too small for what bound them. Instead, they breathed in unison for a moment, sealing their fate as though history itself paused to witness, and in that breath, long, deep, defiant, the Widow of Stono understood that the rebellion had already begun, not in blades or fire or flight, but in the stillness before movement, in the decision that life in bondage was not life at all, and the first true action in any revolt is not the strike, it is the refusal to remain silent. The dawn broke thick and colorless the morning after the first embers of revolt were lit, not in flame yet, but in the marrow of those who had chosen defiance, and the world felt suspended, as though the land itself sensed a tremor building beneath the quiet surface of routine, and Alara rose with the same controlled steadiness she had cultivated across years of grief and resolve, her body moving through familiar motions, though nothing inside her remained familiar. For she knew that once a rebellion breathes, even in secret, every gesture becomes sharpened by consequence. She moved through the morning tasks as though nothing had shifted, feeding chickens beside women who hummed work songs without knowing they were standing next to history, shaking corn husks free of dew while the overseer barked idle orders, the banality of oppression pressing down like humidity before a hurricane. Yet beneath the quiet her pulse kept a rhythm of readiness, not frantic but fierce, and she noticed how the others in the circle, those bound to her by whispered vows, mirrored that careful stillness, eyes deliberately soft, shoulders loose, their very calm a mask over coiled determination. She saw the carpenter mending a wagon wheel, each tap of his hammer too measured to be mere labor. Saw the field hand stacking baskets of rice with a precision that could be mistaken for muscle memory, but in truth was concentration turned inward, preserving mental focus for what was coming. Saw the cook tending boiling pots as if timing future chaos by the slow simmer before eventual boil, and Alara found herself struck by the strange symmetry of it, the way rebellion sometimes whispers before it roars, the way great ruptures begin with ordinary footsteps and silent breaths, because a people too long held in chains learn to move in shadows first, and the world has always mistaken patience for passivity. But she knew patience is sometimes the sharpest blade. What unsettled her most, however, was not the watchful stillness of the enslaved, but the subtle shift among the enslavers and overseers, a tightening in their posture and a restlessness in their gaze that suggested instinct. Not knowledge, for men who rule by cruelty often sense danger before they see it, as animals do before storms, and she could tell something beneath their calm was fraying. Mr. Whitlaw, the plantation owner, stood longer than usual on the veranda, scanning the fields with narrowed eyes. Clutching his coffee cup like a talisman against unease, while his wife paced behind curtains, clutching rosary beads as though God might intervene on behalf of their fragile, brittle peace. Even the overseer, who normally strutted like a cock, seemed less confident, pausing every so often to listen. Not for voices, but for a feeling, as though rebellion was a sound only the guilty could hear coming. Patrol riders appeared earlier than usual, circling the property perimeter with lanterns swaying in the gray morning haze, dogs sniffing the earth for threats, though none had yet been loosed, and Alara watched this choreography of tension unfold with a clarity sharpened by necessity, feeling neither triumph nor fear, only inevitability, because once the mind crosses into freedom, fear cannot reclaim its full dominion. It lingers, yes, but becomes background rather than master. The first true test arrived when a young enslaved boy stumbled while carrying water buckets and spilled a portion near the main steps, prompting the overseer to lash him across the back in a swift, automatic gesture of discipline, a gesture that had passed as ordinary brutality 1,000 times before. Yet on this day the whip cracked differently, not across flesh alone, but across invisible nerves, stretched taut through the enslaved community, and Alara saw a flicker in several sets of eyes nearby. Not open rebellion. Not yet, but a tremble of rage like heat rising from sun-baked earth, and for the first time she feared not the overseer's violence, but the possibility that someone might act too soon, breaking the fragile timing that made survival possible, and she inhaled deeply, grounding herself in the knowledge that resistance is not only an act of courage but an act of discipline, and she prayed silently, not to any deity she trusted, but to memory itself, that restraint would hold just long enough for strategy to exceed rage. She moved to comfort the boy after the overseer strode away, kneeling beside him not with words but with touch, her fingers brushing the welt, her presence a salve where speech could not yet serve. And when he looked at her, she saw not just pain but awakening, for even the young absorb revolution through skin before language can hold it. As the day stretched forward, the plantation continued its performance of normalcy, rice baskets filling, axes splitting wood, children carrying kindling, but beneath every routine motion lived calculation, and the conspirators passed subtle signals like breadcrumbs across shadow, an extra beat in a work song, a glance held 1 second too long near the barn, a scrap of tobacco placed on the ground near the smokehouse door, as a sign that the patrol patterns had changed, and Alara gathered each fragment, assembling the map of what lay ahead. She knew Sunday would bring opportunity, when enslaved people were permitted a measure of movement to attend worship or gather near the river under the guise of fishing or washing clothes, and she knew that revolt did not begin with blades alone but with movement, controlled, coordinated, deliberate, and she felt the air thickening with the nearness of decision. Yet the moments between that dawn and the planned gathering felt like eternity stretched tight, especially when a trader from Charleston arrived unexpectedly near noon, speaking in low, urgent tones to the master about rumors of unrest farther inland, tales of men praying in secret circles, drums heard at night on distant properties, and women refusing food for reasons overseers did not understand. And Alara listened from the shade near the kitchen house, her heart beat steady but her muscles coiled, recognizing that rumor is both ally and threat. It spreads fear among oppressors, but also sharpens their watch, and she knew the window for action was narrowing, not expanding, so she recalibrated silently, seizing calm from the knowledge that revolts do not wait for perfect timing. They seize the timing that exists. That afternoon, as heat pressed upon the fields like an unkind hand, a sudden heavy storm rolled in, clouds thick and dark as bruises, thunder groaning low across the marsh, and rain fell hard, turning dirt to slick clay and muting the overseer's voice beneath its roar. And Alara welcomed the storm as if it were an ally. For storms offer cover. Storms disrupt patrols. Storms make torches harder to see and footfalls harder to track. And as lightning cracked across the horizon, she whispered in her mind that nature itself seemed unwilling to stand idle while bondage persisted. Beneath the rain, she saw the carpenter meet eyes with the field hand across rows of rice, saw the cook step outside briefly to watch the storm's force, saw the young man who had lost his siblings lift his face into the downpour, and something in each expression told her the same truth. Fear was still present, but it no longer led them. Resolve had taken the front. When the rain ceased and dusk crept across the plantation like a slow-moving shadow, Ilara felt the shift deepen. For evening meant gathering spaces, near the slave quarters, near the well, near the outskirts where trees thickened into dark refuge. And though she maintained her outward composure, she knew that this night would test them, because rebellion often begins not in fire but in breath shared under fading light, in plans spoken in the guise of prayer circles or shared chores, in the decision to trust one another more than fear the consequences. They met after supper in ones and twos, drifting toward a clearing edged by palmetto and river reeds, the air smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. And when she saw them assembled, men and women, young and old, she felt the weight and honor of it. For revolts are not driven by legends but by ordinary souls who choose extraordinary risk. And though history would remember names sparsely, many hearts would bleed for the freedom of future generations. This gathering held no songs, no whispers of farewell to old life, only breath and presence and the knowledge that each step from this point was irrevocable. And standing in their midst, Ilara thought of her husband not as lost but as walking beside them, part of a lineage that stretched backward across oceans and forward across centuries. And she understood that in every rebellion there comes a moment when silence falls not because there is nothing to say, but because everything has already been decided. They did not embrace, for displays of affection could be witnessed by prying eyes. They simply dispersed slowly, each returning to their quarters before suspicion could brew, carrying the stillness of warriors preparing for dawn. That night, as she lay on a pallet woven from rice sacks, the moonlight filtering through gaps in the wooden slats above her, she heard distant drumming carried faintly by wind, not nearby but somewhere far across the marshland, and she did not know whether it was real sound or memory echoing across time. But she welcomed it, for drums in Africa once signaled war, mourning, celebration and warning, and though banned in the colonies for fear of their power, the rhythm lived in footfalls and whispered humming, in heartbeat and memory, and she felt that ancestral pulse align with her own, steady and fierce. Sleep did not come easily, not because she trembled with fear, but because the imminence of action sharpens the senses until the body refuses rest, and she spent the hours before dawn breathing slow, rehearsing routes through swamp grasses and rice channels, envisioning which path would carry the children to safety if bloodshed began early, and she held in her palm a small piece of cloth that had belonged to her husband, worn soft from years of hiding, a relic not of grief but of purpose. In the final quiet before sunrise, when the world felt held between breaths, she rose and tied her headscarf with deliberate care, smoothing its folds the way a soldier might lace boots before battle, and she stepped into the humid pre-dawn dimness with no tremor in her limbs, only certainty. The cicadas had begun their morning call, and mist curled low across the fields like spirits rising, and Ilara walked through it unblinking, knowing the hours ahead would carve themselves into the marrow of those who survived, and the soil that received those who did not, and she whispered in her heart not prayer, but truth. That silence had been her cage, and fire, whether literal or born of action, would be her voice, and she knew that soon. The world would learn that a widow's grief could ignite not sorrow but revolution. Before dawn fully broke, the sky still holding the blue-black hush of night, Ilara stepped into the world as though it were an altar, every breath a vow, every footfall a preparation, and the plantation around her felt suspended, neither asleep nor awake, but caught in the fragile stillness before rupture, as if the air itself braced for what history would soon claim. She moved quietly among the quarters, sensing the stirring of bodies waking under the same weight of knowing, and she paused outside the door of the carpenter, hearing the faint scrape of metal against wood. He was sharpening again, not out of fear but ritual, as if honing steel steadied his soul. Beyond him the cook whispered a prayer not in the tongue the white mistress demanded on Sundays, but in one carried from across the ocean, a low, steady melody that folded around the dawn like ancestral armor. A few children stirred and blinked at Ilara as she passed, unaware of the storm rising around them, and she felt a pang. Revolution always carries the innocence of the young on its back, but to live without freedom is to never taste innocence at all. The fields woke gradually, mist lifting in slow ribbons from the damp earth, and as the call to the rice paddies sounded, the enslaved moved in practiced rhythm, their bodies betraying nothing while their minds beat in unison like war drums muffled beneath cloth. The overseer rode out, boots glinting with dew, posture rigid with the brittle confidence of a man who senses a threat he cannot name. His eyes narrowed at every rustle of cane and every whispered breath, paranoia sharpening his cruelty, for masters and overseers always fear what they cannot see rising. Alara kept her gaze lowered, but her senses stretched outward across the landscape, like threads connecting her to each conspirator. The carpenter at the wagon shed, the young man near the tools, the field hand near the riverbank, the cook waiting near the smokehouse door, each one embodying stillness like a tiger holding breath before springing forward. The day moved with aching slowness, each task weighted by the knowledge of what waited beyond its completion. The whites on the property felt it too. They held their cups tighter, spoke in clipped tones, clung to routine like men clinging to a raft in rising floodwaters. A patrol rider passed twice instead of once, boots muddy, brow furrowed. He dismounted to speak to the overseer in low tones, and though their words did not travel far, their bodies spoke plainly. Fear shadowed them, spreading through the plantation like a scent. Rumors had preceded the rebellion, not of their plan specifically, but of unrest in the region, and rumor is oxygen to fear, especially for men who rule by domination. Alara watched, silent sentinel among the reeds and rice, and she knew the moment of choice approached, to act before suspicion tightened too far, or to risk losing momentum. Near midday, a crack of gunfire split the air in the distance, not from their plantation, but far enough to be uncertain yet close enough to jolt every spine straight. The overseer snapped his head toward the tree line, shifting in his saddle, and the enslaved froze not in fear but calculation. Was that another plantation rising? A hunter? A warning shot? The unknown crackled like dry twigs underfoot, and Alara felt time press in on them, urging but not demanding, reminding her that resistance is not ballet but wildfire. Precision matters, but so does seizing wind when it shifts. She moved toward the riverbank under pretense of filling water gourds, her hands steady, her breath quiet. And there she found the young man waiting, eyes burning like coals held too long. He did not speak. Speaking risked everything, but the set of his jaw said what his voice could not. He had heard the gunshot as signal, not noise, and he was ready. Still, Alara did not rush. She had learned from her husband and from whispers of uprisings past that rebellion cracks when leadership bends to impulse instead of resolve. She dipped the gourd in the river, letting water swell into its hollow belly, and she closed her eyes briefly, feeling the current tug, gentle but persistent, like freedom calling softly across distance. When she opened them, she met his gaze and let her chin dip once, no more, no less, and he nodded in return before walking back to the fields, shoulders relaxed, steps unhurried, carrying calm like a blade hidden beneath cloth. The decision was made. At dusk they would move. The afternoon light grew harsh and metallic, and tension built in every rustle of cane. Sweat clung to skin, not just from labor but from restrained urgency, and overseers barked louder, sensing unease not with logic but with animal instinct. At one point a horse reared unexpectedly, spooked by something unseen, perhaps a snake, perhaps nothing more than the shifting energy beneath the soil, and the overseer swore loudly, jerking at the reins, his temper fraying like rope worn thin. A white child on the porch cried suddenly, sensing fear from adults like a wind change before a storm, and the mistress hurried to hush him, her voice cracking slightly despite her attempts at calm. Even the dogs paced restlessly, noses twitching, tails stiff. Nature always reads rebellion before ink or blood confirm it. As the sun dipped bleeding gold into the marsh, Alara moved toward the quarters, pulse steady as a clock. The hush of evening settled like a held breath, and lanterns flickered to life near the main house as if trying to push back night's inevitability. The enslaved gathered in the guise of communal rest, mothers braiding daughters' hair, men sharpening small tools as though for work, elders rocking slowly on worn stools, but beneath the surface, the atmosphere pulsed, anticipation coiled tight, hearts beating not for survival but for something larger. When the sky deepened to indigo and fireflies blinked like sparks scattered across the fields, Alara gave the signal, not with a shout but with a simple act. She stood. Those who knew rose moments later, their movement quiet as leaves shifting in a breeze. The carpenter retrieved the tools he had hidden beneath the wagon boards, a makeshift club, a sharpened chisel, a length of iron. The cook slipped a small vial into her pocket, a concoction of herbs and bitter roots that could fell a man if forced down his throat or slipped into his drink. The young man tied his shirt around his waist, muscles taut, jaw set, ready to strike or run or die. Knowing each outcome held its own dignity, women with infants strapped to their backs positioned themselves close, not to fight, but to move swiftly when the moment demanded escape. And then, as darkness settled fully and cicadas roared in the humid night, they moved, not as a mob, but as a current silent and unstoppable, feet pressing into earth that knew their suffering and now bore witness to their rising. They did not head first to the big house. Instead, they moved toward the armory shed, crude but vital, where muskets and powder were kept beneath locks meant to hold fear in and freedom out. The carpenter worked quickly, hands steady, tools whispering instead of clanging, and within moments the lock splintered. Quiet, controlled, inevitable. Firearms were scarce and dangerous to use, loud enough to summon death if mishandled, so they took powder, blades, and the long wooden tools that could crack skulls or break open doors. And with each item passed, their resolve hardened. Torches were next, bundles of cloth soaked in fat, prepared days earlier under the guise of cooking scraps, now lit from a small ember shielded in a clay bowl. Flame hissed to life, small at first, then steady, and Alara felt its heat brush her face like a breath from ancestors urging strength. But she did not rush to raise it high. Tonight was not yet the night of full blaze. Fire was a declaration, and declarations come after first strike. Tonight was movement, positioning, awakening, a spark that would become inferno when morning's light exposed the truth. At the edge of the field, one man, older, his back scarred like a map of cruelty, began to hum. It was not song, not fully, but rhythm, ancient and pulsing, heartbeat turned into sound. Others picked it up. Quiet at first, then deeper, and the hum became a vibration in the soil, a signal older than the language of their captors, and in that sound lived war, grief, and faith. Alara closed her eyes briefly, letting it wash through her like river water, cleansing fear, honoring the dead, summoning those yet to be free. Then, just before they moved toward the slave patrol shack to disable communication, the distant crack of a branch snapped through the night, a sound too heavy for animal, too deliberate for wind. Every body tensed, muscles seizing, breath pausing mid-chest, eyes scanned the dark. A figure moved in the shadows, slow, hesitant, unsteady. The carpenter raised his tool ready to strike, but Alara lifted her hand. A single silhouette emerged, a young white overseer's apprentice, pale-faced, trembling, lips parting in stunned horror as he took in the scene. Torches, tools, faces carved with purpose. For a moment, the world wavered, freedom on one side, death and ruin on the other, suspended by the breath of a boy who stood between power and its unraveling. He could scream. He could run. He could beg. Instead he froze, eyes wide, soul exposed. And in that instant, Alara stepped forward, quieter than night itself, and everything balanced on the edge of her next breath, mercy or strike, concealment or fire, survival or sacrifice. And as she stood before him, history held its breath, waiting to see whether the night would keep its secrets, or whether this would be the spark that turned quiet uprising into open war. She did not know how long she lay beside the riverbank staring at the sky, feeling the grit of sand under her palms and the pulse of her heartbeat in her skull. But when she finally lifted her head, the sun had risen enough to reveal what the night had taken, and what the dawn demanded she carry. Smoke still clung to the horizon, thin and gray like a morning veil stretched over the land. The bodies of those who had followed her lay scattered along the marsh path like silent testimony, carved into earth and flesh. She rose with trembling knees, each step aching with memory, and moved from face to face, breathing quiet prayers over the fallen. She touched their foreheads as if sealing their story into time so the wind could not steal it. None had died begging. None had died bending. In each still face she saw remnants of the fire she had lit. Not the burning of houses or fields, but the ember in the soul that refuses to believe belonging to another human is law. Her hands shook not from regret, but from the weight of enduring alone the truth that their uprising was not failure. It was the beginning of a wound history would be forced to remember. Somewhere behind her, Red Dove's body rested in marsh reeds, and the memory of his cracked laughter, of the wild daring in his final sprint, returned like a blade twisting slow, reminding her that survival had never been her aim. Freedom had. She whispered a vow to each face she touched, not to avenge, not to forget, but to live long enough so their names would never be pronounced only by those who condemned them. She walked away only when she could no longer trust her legs to keep her upright if she stayed. The marsh grass parted around her like a shroud being drawn aside, releasing her back to the land of the breathing. Every rustle startled her. Every bird call felt like warning. She moved carefully, body low, listening for hoofbeats, voices, dogs, anything that signaled that the colonial militia still hunted, still thirsted for the blood of those who had dared to imagine themselves more than inventory. The morning heat rose quickly, heavy and wet, soaking her clothes and blurring the horizon in waves, and she felt the weight not only of hunger and fatigue but of directionlessness. Freedom won in a moment was one thing. Keeping it was another battle entirely. She had no weapons, no food, no map, only instinct and the muscle memory of fear and defiance. She followed the river south, knowing water meant paths, paths meant people, and people meant danger or salvation depending on whether their souls bowed to power or to truth. She thought of her husband then, not as bones in a field, but as breath in her ear urging her forward, as the hand that once steadied her in moonlight, as the voice that planted the idea that fear was not proof of weakness, but a sign that the body recognized what the spirit was about to overcome. She pressed her palm against her chest as if to hold him there, the way one might protect a flame cupped in the wind. Hours bled into more hours, and hunger gnawed like a creature born inside her ribs. She found wild figs and chewed slowly, knowing too much too fast would betray her with sickness. Every step scratched, every thorn drew fine red lines across her legs, but pain grounded her, reminding her that numbness was death's cousin. When distant voices rose across the water, she froze and listened. Not English. Soft syllables, rhythmic, the familiar sound of West African tongues carried by those who had refused to let the Middle Passage strip language from flesh. She crouched and followed the sound as one follows a prayer whispered through a door. Soon she saw them. 3 women kneeling in the shallows, washing cloth, their backs bent but their posture unbroken, humming a song older than the land beneath them. Her instinct was to run, to distrust every living thing, but the melody pierced the armor that survival had forced around her. It was not a song of suffering. It was not a song of labor. It was a song of remembering who you were before chains touched your skin. A warning, a calling, a promise. She stepped forward slowly, announcing herself not with sound but with presence, allowing the light to carry her silhouette onto the river surface before she reached speaking distance. The women startled, but their fear did not turn to accusation. Their eyes widened, not with suspicion but recognition, as if they had waited for someone like her. Not her name, not her story, but her spirit. When she collapsed from exhaustion, they moved as a unit, lifting her, supporting her weight, carrying her deeper into the brush where no patrol would ever think to search. In the hidden shelter of cypress and palmetto, they gave her water and herbs and sat around her in a semicircle, not asking questions because they already knew the shape of violence and could fill in the spaces between her breaths. Only when she could breathe without gasping did the eldest speak, voice lined like riverstone, solid and smooth. They had heard the gunshots, seen the smoke, felt the tension in the soil itself. The land had carried word faster than riders. "Which side did you die on?" the elder asked. Not to shame, but to understand whether this woman rising from the marsh was a spirit of surrender or a spirit of revolt. She answered with silence at first, but silence is not emptiness. It is a kind of testimony when spoken by a survivor of crushed fire. Her eyes held the truth long before her voice did. When she finally spoke, she spoke only one sentence, but it was enough to braid her fate with theirs. She had chosen fire. They did not question further. They fed her roots boiled soft and bitter, pressed healing leaves to her ankles, wrapped her in cloth woven coarse but warm. She slept under their watch as if tethered to a world where care still existed. In dreams she saw flames not devouring but cleansing, licking away rot from history's bones. She saw her husband laughing in a place without chains. She saw Red Dove running across fields that rolled like ocean waves, unchased, unbroken. When she awoke, the elder told her there was a place further south, a settlement hidden in swamp and moss, a community of runaways, free Africans, and those born on soil that never belonged to empire. Spanish territory lay beyond, a thin but real promise, where baptism offered a thin thread of legal escape, where English law lost its grip, where whispers of freedom grew into something sturdier. But the journey was perilous. The patrols hunted without rest and the forests swallowed the careless. Still, she did not hesitate. Freedom was not a finish line. It was a road walked on bleeding feet. She had not survived to hide forever. She had survived to carry the memory of rebellion into the future, to plant it where it might root deeper. The women armed her not with steel but with knowledge, where the creek bent like an elbow, where the cypress roots formed a bridge, where patrols drank and bragged, where the Spanish traders passed with silver and rumor. They braided her hair tight so branches would not snag it, pressed medicine into a pouch and sent her at dawn while the sky still held the softness of a world waking slow. She crossed land like a shadow crossing memory, slipping past traps and tracks, feeling the ground pulse with the history of those who had run before her. Some had made it. Some had been dragged back. Some had vanished into swamp water where bodies disappear but stories do not. She walked in rhythm with all of them, each footfall a hymn to defiance. When voices approached, she sank into underbrush. When dogs barked, she moved into water to erase her scent. When thunder rolled, she thanked the sky for drowning footsteps and whispers. The journey stretched not in miles, but in the pull between terror and determination. Fear was constant, but it never outweighed purpose. At last, after days of motion that felt like years of rebirth, she saw it, a cluster of huts raised on stilts above dark water, smoke rising gentle, the faint sound of laughter mixed with drum beats echoing like heartbeats across the swamp. It was not a city. It was not a nation. It was a promise made real by those who refused to kneel. When she stepped into view, the people there did not cheer. They stood in solemn welcome, honoring her arrival as one honors the arrival of a storm that has spared you but reshaped the world. A woman stepped forward, a child clinging to her side, and offered her a place by the fire. She took it, but she did not collapse. She sat tall, spine straight, gaze steady, carrying the weight of the fallen into this new world like a banner no flame could consume. Years would pass and her hair would silver, and children raised free would sit at her feet asking why she walked with eyes that saw beyond trees and river. She would tell them not of death, not of fear, but of choosing fire over silence. She would speak names as seeds, planting memory so deep that no empire could uproot it. They would grow to know that freedom is not given. It is built, defended, inherited like breath passed from mother to child. And long after her bones returned to the earth, when scholars wrote of the Stono Rebellion and soldiers praised kings and governors, the people who lived outside those records would whisper a different truth, that before men marched with muskets, there was a widow who carried a spark through blood and marsh and memory, a woman who refused to let grief become obedience, and that from her quiet blaze, a rising was born that still burns wherever a human heart refuses to bow.